That's it. You're there.
So if I can move these little pictures. There we go. Okay then, so today we're going to look at the Mont Cenis Railway. It does have an implication and impact for French postal history, of course, but equally it impacts British postal history, Far East postal history, Italian postal history. So it is a wider story. But Chris thinks it's worth looking at, so here we go. We're only talking about a railway which was 49 miles in length, but the staggering thing was that it was built across this mountain range of the Alps between France and Italy, and it was only in operation for 3.5 years. So how could a little railway like that have had a significant impact on postal history, the carriage of mail? It wasn't as if you know about it, anything about it. It wasn't an ordinary railway. It was in fact something of an engineering marvel because it had to, rise very high up, and there was gradients as steep as 1 in 12. And the other thing, of course, is that this was planned and constructed at a time when the building of the railway tunnel had already started. So they were building a tunnel through the mountains, knowing that ultimately this lovely little mountain railway would be redundant. We'll come to that later on in the story. So this was the Mont Cenis Railway. It operated between Saint-Michel de Maurienne in France and across to Susa in Italy, and opened in June 1868 and ran up to October 1871. Now, I've divided the display into 4 parts. The first part is simple. It's only one sheet. It's a map showing the route of the railway. I'm a geographer by training, so I like maps. So we need to know where it is. The second part of the display, though, looks at, well, what happened before the railway was built and operational. What impact was there for French postal historians to be able to consider? Obviously, then the middle part of the display looks at the running of the railway itself between those 2 dates, and again, the implications for postal history. And finally, I just briefly at the end touch on what happened after the closure of the railway and the opening of what became known as the Fréjus Tunnel. And again, there were changes to French cancellations to reflect that. So there we have the map then. The company was first launched in 1864, and in Britain, under the direction of the 3rd Duke of Sutherland. He had one of his places near me, of course, here in Stoke-on-Trent at Trentham. And it was a commercial undertaking, and he was going to build this railway over the mountains. And the reason for that, of course, is that it was quite hard to carry passengers and goods, little bits of freight, over that railway, because you could only get so far by train, and then you had to get on to what the French called a diligence, which was a kind of stagecoach, usually with 4 to 6 horses, but often more if they wanted the speed. But in winter, of course, the diligence carriage had to be put onto sledges in order to get up and down the mountain. So they went ahead with raising funds for this, trying to reach agreement with the French and Italian authorities. And eventually the company was inaugurated in February 1866. And so they began the construction of this 80-kilometre route. It was also known as the Fell Railway, after the engineer John Barraclough fell. I'll talk about that a little later, with these steep gradients. And eventually it began a month later. There were extensive trials to make sure it was operational, going to be an operational success. There were some problems. One of those was with the engines, but also in the construction of the railway, they had one really bad weather winter, which was blowing, washing away parts of the mountain and the track as fast as they were building it. But nevertheless, they got it operational. So it ran between Saint-Michel, de Maurienne, and Suza. So what happened prior to the railway? Well, there was nothing really until 1808, and then a new road was built from Lens-le-Bourg in France over to Suza in Italy via the Maurienne Valley, and then over the summit called the Mont Cenis, and this was open to traffic. And as soon as it was, the service, as I mentioned, of these diligences were operating. And they ran between Lyon and Turin via Chambéry, and crossing in winter, bit of a struggle, and the bodies were mounted on runners. So here's a couple of examples then of postal history in that period. An 1818 letter going to Turin. You can see the marque de passage at the top with the CF3R indicating how to calculate the payment. And then one in the other direction, 1851, from Turin to Saint-Jean. Now, the next important part of this story was the extension of the railway. Because Sardinia was not part of France, this part of what we know of as France now, of course, was part of Sardinia. And so the Italians started building this railway from 1853, operating from Colonies, where the French railway ended. And again, it was built with financial support from English backers and engineers. That happened a lot in continental railway building. They were well behind, really, in that sense, behind the British financiers and engineers in railway construction. And the Mont Cenis Railway, of course, was built pretty much with British capital and British entrepreneurs and British engineers. And ultimately, the railway was extended to Saint-Michel de Maurienne. But it was still being carried by diligences. The passengers and the mail and everything else was still carried that way. The railway only went so far. So here's a little letter from Modena to Marseille, sent via Turin. You can see that from the cancellations there. Nice ambulance cancellation top left. That's the beauty of our hobby, isn't it? That there are so many clues on letters if you know how to read them. And in this case, the cachets and the cancellations indicate how letters were carried. The ambulance top left was applied on board the Victor Emmanuel Railway, and there's a French ambulance entry mark for Toulouse, indicating it had come from Sardinia. Here's another letter from this Victor Emmanuel Railway period. You can see centre left, there's a lovely railway cachet there, oval cachet. The diligence took 9 hours in summer, but anything between 10.5 and 17 hours in winter. So, still a significant journey to be made, even going part way by railway. Again, you've got some interesting cancellations here. And the third letter that I've got from the railway period on nice headed note paper from the railway company, an agent of the railway company, mentioning the carriage via Mont Cenis. The railway by then had been extended to Saint-Michel. Now, of course, there was a plebiscite, wasn't there? And that area was transferred back to France. When that happened, the bit of the Italian railway in France became part of PLM, the Paris-Lyon Mediterranean Railway. That happened in 1862. But as you can imagine, I mean, PLM is a French company who made money out of carrying passengers and mail and freight down to Marseille, and then putting them on boats to head east from that point. So, if we were being honest about it, they weren't particularly keen on using this new route going as far as Saint-Michel de Maurienne by train and then over the Alps on the diligence. But here, surprisingly, is a letter that was carried by rail and road across the Alps, despite the sender having put par vapeur on the right-hand side. They had expected it to go. It's from Marseille, so we would all have expected it to have gone by ship. Sorry, it's to Marseille, so we would have all expected it to go by ship, but no. The Italians had improved their railway services, and so you can tell from the cancellation, the French entry mark of arrival, Italy Cenis, you can tell that it didn't travel by ship, but it came in overland. And equally, you've got French ambulant entry cancellations. So coming from Sardinia into France, they introduced a new entry mark, so Sardinia Cenis. This one applied on the night ambulant coming west, and from there it transferred to the Lyon to Paris Railway, another night ambulant, and then carried to Strasbourg. The French were quick, weren't they, to when things changed, to introduce new cancellations to reflect the new state of affairs. And here they are being applied on the PLM railways. Here's an entry mark, cancellation from Saint-Michel de Maurienne. Not very commonly seen, this one. Still, don't forget, the mail and passengers are being transferred over the mountain by diligence. You can see, I mean, these are not isolated items of mail. that are being sent that way. And by 1867, this is before the railway was introduced. If you look for the cancellations, you can tell the route. The mail coming this way isn't rare. There was plenty of it. Thought it'd be nice to include an example of a courier convoyeur. The convoyeur, of course, was the on-train service which operated on the branch lines, the smaller ones. They lived in the postal officials lived in half a carriage, and you can tell which are the courier convoyeur cancellations quite easily because of what the French call the ondulé, John Whiteside used to call the wigglies. Nice cancellation there. This one is, it was carried privately. The letter was carried privately from Turin in someone's pocket. And then they arrived at Saint Michel, got off the diligence and prepared to get onto the train and posted it there. That's why it's received the convoyeur's cancellation. Then the mail and the passengers were transferred to the main line at Chambéry, and eventually the mail ended up at Saint-Rambert. So that brings us nicely to the end of the pre-railway period. Now we're going to go and look at the operation of the railway itself. There's an engraving of the first class carriage on the Mont Cenis Railway, very small carriages. Most trains had a locomotive, 3 coaches, a goods van, and a fourgon, if I've pronounced that correctly, which held the guard and luggage. The British, as I've said, were greatly involved in this railway. Thomas Brassey, who you may have heard of, is considered to be the greatest railway builder in the world, from a little book that I've got on his life. He was the engineer for the railway, but there were key people from British railway undertakings involved in the company. John Barraclough Fell was important. He was the person who designed the locomotives after he'd done several experiments in Britain, one of which was in Cromford, which is not too far away from Stoke. I was there last week, in fact. And the special thing about it was that he had a horizontal set of wheels under the engine, which gripped a central rail, a third rail, if you like, and therefore it gave greater adhesion. Because some of the gradients were pretty steep, particularly on the Italian side. They had some steep curves as well, which was why the coaches were quite small. And it was a smaller gauge, I think, from memory. Here's the terminus on the French side at Saint-Michel de Maurienne. The MCR Railway, the Mont Cenis Railway, used a new platform, if you like, which was built on the left-hand side. As you look at this postcard, as we look at this postcard here, on the left-hand side was where the new line started from. Now, the service operated as far as Susa in Italy. And once passengers got off the railway at Saint-Michel, they transferred there to a service which operated further away into France. And between there were several stations, primarily at Modane and Lanslebourg. There was a station at Termignon, but having done some research on it for this particular cover, passengers could board there, but mail wasn't accepted at that point on the train. And mail was taken to Lanslebourg and then put onto the train as a kind of intermediate halt. So you can see the postman's number, 19, on the rear. And he carried it on his round to Lanslebourg, where it was put into the post and cancelled, and then sent to Turin. Hope that makes sense. So the early westbound mail on the railway, here's two examples from July and October, which were quite early. The line actually cost £392,000 to build, which in today's money is £52 million. So it wasn't a cheap undertaking that they embarked upon. The examples here are showing the French cancellations. So slight changes to the cancellations in use once the railway had started operating. And here's one coming from the Papal States to Paris and carried on the railway. There's a French entry cancellation here at Saint-Michel. If you think about the importance that this railway had on the carriage of mail, say from England, going over to Italy, it actually reduced the letters delivery time by 1 day. It made sufficient difference that the mail could be carried a whole day earlier. That's travelling between Italy and England and vice versa. The cachet in blue here is unrecorded by Noel. This particular letter you can see must have been held up at some point, because it wouldn't have taken, by this time, it certainly wouldn't have taken anywhere near like 3 days to travel as far as Paris. Now here's a very unusual route, really, in a sense, to use the railway. So it's coming from Italy, and it gets as far as Naples. You can see on the bottom left, there's a maritime cancellation. So it's come into Naples from Palermo on the ship, on a commercial ship. You can see from that cachet on the bottom left. And once there, from the cancellations, you can tell that it's been carried all the way up through Italy on the Italian train service and over the Mont Cenis Railway to get to Paris, which again you wouldn't have expected. Most of the mail coming from Italy would formerly have gone to Marseille, stayed on the vessel and gone to Marseille. But no, here the evidence is that the Italians were directing mail onto their own railway services rather than the French ones, and sending it from Brindisi up to Susa and then over the Mont Cenis Railway. That's the beauty of postal history again, isn't it? If you read the clues that are on the letter, you can often find a route which is perhaps not what you would have expected, certainly not what it had been in previous years. Now, I've got a couple of examples now of British mail carried via the railway. Here's an October 1868 letter. You can tell the route from the cancellation right at the top, which is of course on the rear of the letter, and it's the ambulance from Susa to Turin. So that was how it was sent. Two more examples. Here's two items of mail to Italy, both 1870, and with the Italian ambulance cancellations. The British involvement was considerable. There were people who took the risk and had the engineering nous as well as the commercial nous to do this. Were men like Compton and Blunt and Brassey, who I've mentioned, as well as the Duke of Sutherland, all involved in railway operations in this country and looking to find profit in the continent. Here's another letter with underneath it. I've taken a copy of the letter heading. Again, another agent who's offering grande vitesse for the carriage of mail using the Mont Cenis Railway, as opposed to petite vitesse, by still being able to send it over on the diligence if that was what you preferred. Nice oval cachet of the transport company, and a very nice courier convoyeur cancellation on the line from Saint-Michel to Chambéry. Now, let's develop our thinking a bit further afield, because we need to consider the impact that it had on the Indian and the Eastern mails. People do sometimes get confused about this. And also the next slide, you'll see that the British had started looking at the possibility of using Brindisi as early as July 1865. So, this was well before the railway. They were kind of thinking ahead and knowing that the tunnel had started to be built and progress was being made. And I was reading that when the post office let a new contract for Indian mail from October 69, they'd built into it an option for the mail to be carried via the railway and Brindisi. So they were very much on the ball as to what was happening. And of course, this was one of the reasons why the operators of the railway, the people who'd taken the risk, had thought it worthwhile, because they thought they'd got a good lifespan of being able to carry quite a significant volume of mail if all the eastern mails and the Australian mails were transferred to the railway. And this is what happened. The post office made this decision from October 1869 to give priority to the carriage via the Mont Cenis Railway. Made a significant journey reduction time. The P&O picked up the mail from Brindisi. Here's a nice letter from good old Stoke-on-Trent, sent to Lahore at the initial shilling rate. I'll come back to that in a minute. And nice cancellations on arrival in India. The other element of confusion in some people's minds, having read the literature, is that people often say that it was the Franco-Prussian War and the problems in transporting mail through Paris to get down to Marseille in order to catch the boat to go east, which resulted in the switch to Brindisi. Well, it did to an extent, but by the time the Franco-Prussian War was going strong, the railway had been operating for quite some time. So I think it's fair to say that the railway had a far greater impact on postal history matters, that is the carriage of mail, than did the Franco-Prussian War, which was kind of a little extra factor which came into being. Here's a very nice letter which was sent to Australia, and the writer speaks, or sent from Australia, sorry. Have I put to Australia? I have, haven't I? It's sent from Australia via Sydney. No, let me get this right. No, it's sent to Australia. I'm getting confusing myself. And the writer talks about it being posted the day following. Speaks about having just received mail sent from Brindisi for the first time. Sorry, that wasn't very clear, was it? But 3rd of November. And the effect of the Franco-Prussian War. And this person writing to Australia and saying that they just received some mail sent via Brindisi for the first time, which was clearly of sufficient interest to them to put it into the letter. Now, we've got another example here of one of a letter travelling from Alexandria to London, which is quite nice. Now they paid the shilling rate. So what happened, the post office decided that if mail was going to be sent via Brindisi, that is through Italy, then they would have to increase the rate. This letter, though, was sent, it was posted the day following a reduction in the rate to 8p. So they could have sent it at the reduced rate. So let me explain that again. The rates were increased by the British Post Office, became a shilling to Egypt, 1 and 4 to India and Ceylon, 1 and a penny to Australia and New Zealand, 1 and 7 to China and Strait settlements. But that rate increase didn't last for very long, and the rates were reduced. But the person sending this letter was unaware of it, and still paid the shilling higher rate rather than the 8-penny reduced rate, which had actually been introduced the day before the letter was sent, was posted. But obviously they were unaware of that. So that's got a kind of double interest. And here's a second example of the new rate, which is a letter from London to Aden. This was sent at the higher shilling rate and marked as the letters were marked at that time, as we've seen, haven't we, looking at a lot of postal history, they were either marked via Brindisi or via Marseille. And we have this short period of time when the rate via Brindisi was more expensive. I've been trying now for several years to get a copy of the boxed cachet which is marked when people didn't pay the higher rate. And despite sending in some mouth-watering bids, I still haven't been successful. But one day, that's the joy of searching, isn't it? Yeah, here's a final example of this period before we get on to the actual closure, of late female being sent to Italy, taking advantage not only of the more direct route, but also being able to make a late posting from London in order to catch the ferry going across the channel. Here's French mails being sent via Brindisi. As I mentioned at the beginning, really this railway over the Mont Cenis had a significant impact for for the French railways, and also for the Port of Marseille, because the Port of Marseille declined in significance once Brindisi became a main port for carrying passengers and freight and mail, initially over the railway, but then through the tunnel. Marseille definitely suffered as a consequence. So we come to the closure of the railway. The good old French delayed the closure of the railway because they hadn't completed their bit of the railway line to the tunnel entrance in sufficient time. So that gave the Mont Cenis Railway a stay, if you like, and continued operating for several more weeks. The letter on the right is particularly interesting because it was carried on the penultimate journey. The last trains therefore ran on the 15th of October, and the line closed. That was it. The rail stock was sold off, and everything moved to the tunnel which became known as the Fréjus Tunnel. Had, as a consequence, a whole new set of ambulance and entry cancellations introduced, particularly by the French. Now, the reason why the tunnel opened so quickly against everyone's expectations was that what they expected to take 40 years to complete when they started building that tunnel in the 1850s was actually completed in 14 years. And that was solely as a result of the developments, huge developments in improved drilling and blasting going through the mountains. That was the reason why the Mont Cenis Railway had such a short life, because the tunnel had just forged ahead using modern ways of cutting the tunnel. Several more examples of different entry marks which were applied. Chambéry is seen, Modane is seen. And the final slide is two postcards to the entrances to the new tunnel. On the French side at Modane, and on the Italian side at Bardonecchia. And so that's the end of the story.
Thank you very, very much, Steve. That's fascinating. If anybody's got any questions, unmute yourselves and please pose them.
Not a question, but your comment, because I know that area very well, because I worked when I was much younger in the area of Modane. But that explains why years later, then we still see, for example, mail coming from Indochina to France. If it was sent to the northern part of the country, basically north of Lyon, it would sometimes be, offloaded at Brindisi and then travel by train instead of going to Marseille and then be distributed up north. Because it was effectively with, I guess at the time then the Tunnel du Fréjus and the railway there, it was still faster to get the mail distributed. So that's an amazing, the fact that people would go through those lengths of calculating, back then, okay, if I go that route with that train and here and there,
yes,
I can have a few hours on the distribution of the mail, when maybe the mail took 3 weeks to make it to destination is amazing.
Yes. We could learn something these days from those times too, I think.
My God. Yes.
Did they actually dismantle the railway?
Brings to mind in terms of the cost and the amount of money being lost.
Yeah, they made a loss on the venture, I'm afraid. The people who put the money in, they only carried 150,000 passengers over the period of its operation, which was good in a sense, but of course they'd expected this much longer lifespan. And so if you think of the £392,000 that had been spent to build it, they didn't have a long enough term in order to recover those initial costs. And so the people who, they raised funds in two ways. One, directors put money into the company in order to fund the work, but also they had significant loans as well with interest to pay. And so in those short few years it was running, it never earned sufficient return to be able to pay back the people the developers, the commercial guys who'd put in the money in the first place. It's quite sad. But that was what it was all about, wasn't it, in that period? The Victorian period, and just before, it was all about risk and the opportunity for profit. And some won and some lost. I was reading that Thomas Brassey, for example, invested a lot of money in building a Canadian railway, and he lost a lot of money on it. But in terms of the money invested into British railways and some in South America, he made some money too. The sad thing for Thomas Brassey who was perhaps the greatest railway engineer of the age in terms of construction, is that he didn't die a rich man.
Mm.
Can I ask, Steve, are there any remnants of the railway still there for railway enthusiasts to go and look at?
Pretty much no, but someone was telling me that you can still see the route of the railway in places. Because he was telling me he's actually been to have a look at it. I mean, I've travelled a lot, but I haven't been up to look at the old railway. So pretty much no, but yes, a little bit.
Okay.
But and sadly, the railway stock, was sold off. So they didn't keep it as a memento of an engineering.
No, they wouldn't do in those times, would they? It's a pity because that's a little bit of history that's been lost there.
Yeah.
Now, I'm just wondering. I mean, the French are very good at converting old railway tracks into voies left, aren't they, for ramblers and cyclists? I think that might be a bit too steep though for the average cyclist.
Yes.
Actually, to go and see it.
But you see, the railway was built alongside the road, so you can still travel on that road.
Okay, right.
And so, if you know what you're looking for, you can near enough say, "Oh, well, it was there," sort of thing. But there's not too much evidence unless you know what you're looking for.
Fair enough. Thank you.
Are there any more questions? I'll stop recording now, I think. Hold on.